Today, I have with me my co-conspirator at Takshashila, Narayan Ramachandran, who's the geoeconomics fellow. A couple of weeks ago, he wrote a piece in Mint which talked about India participating in stabilizing Europe, in the financial stability of Europe. So, what I thought is I'll catch him and ask him what exactly what are we doing with Europe?
That's a good question. There are many reasons for India not to worry about Europe, since it has more than enough problems of its own as we speak, and probably will have for quite a lot of time. You know, I wrote this piece, and frankly, it's the first piece in which I've got somewhat nasty reactions. But I treat nasty reactions as a sign that maybe I have provoked a streak of thought that is a little different from where we are coming on. So let me tell you why first it's a bad idea.
Okay.
And then let me try to rationalize why it may not be such a bad idea after all. So the simple argument is that India has a fiscal deficit. India has a current account deficit. India has, generally speaking, problems galore for which we need more and more money. And my own addition, I think India also has an implementation deficit.
Okay.
So with all these deficits, which basically means you have a poor balance sheet overall,
Right.
why would you be going and trying to fix someone else's balance sheet? So that's a very sound argument that, don't overstretch your own balance sheet while you attempt to fix other people's. But let me approach this first strategically, and then sort of why it's not such a bad idea economically. I think strategically the answer is, maybe it's time for China's coming out party. Maybe it's premature for India's coming out party today. But between now and whenever India's coming out party is, and I'm going to theorize that's 10 years away, India will have to make 1, 2, or 3 engagements where it is seen to make an engagement on its own terms, rather than hiding behind what I call the petticoat of the IMF,
Right.
or other multilateral organizations.
Right.
And in that context, I think you can evaluate whether this is one such instance where India has the ability to at least say that it is not hiding behind the multilateral cloak. So that's one strategic observation. The second strategic observation is, if you actually think about it, it doesn't cost a whole hell of a lot. As you know, India has foreign exchange reserves of about 300 billion. True that 300 billion is not totally reliable because it still runs a current account deficit, which in turn is dependent upon capital flows. Capital flows can be volatile, as we have seen even this week with the rupee sinking below 51. So, not strong arguments for a stable, solid, foreign exchange reserve of 300 billion. But I do think that a certain core of that is relatively stable. I'm going to pick a number like $150 billion of that, which is probably what we might have gotten to if the 2008 crisis had lasted a little longer. We didn't get down to 100 billion, but we might have gotten there if it had lasted. So I think we have that $100 billion to reallocate in a manner in which not only are we protecting the financial return of that thing, but we're also getting some strategic advantage. So for example, completely separate from this argument, I would allocate a little bit of that $300 billion or even that 150 core to keeping an oil reserve rather than keeping it in dollar or keeping it in gold or keeping it in euros, which is what we do today. Now, my suggestion would be that take some piece of what we have in fiat currencies today from that 300 billion or a core 100 billion and be willing to negotiate with the European Stability Fund in particular that India might be willing to take a ownership stake of a small amount, and I'm going to pick small amount as $10 billion. I think that makes us a player in this strategic game. We would have a lot of discussion and selling that you have to do within India and possibly outside. But I think it gets us into that strategic game. And in my own view, even though there are two sides to this discussion, I would balance it in favor of actually making that.
Okay, but let's say there is a multilateral way of doing this. There's a bilateral way of doing this. And you're saying that the multilateral way is not as good as a bilateral way, right? Now, what's the deal here? Why should that be the case?
Well, it looks like it's a multilateral agency dealing with a multilateral political union that is not quite a fiscal union, etc. So there's too many multi things hanging out. Both the supply side and the demand side of this equation require a consensus of so many entities, which seems like it's unlikely to happen. Frankly, I think Europe's ability to negotiate with, say, a few players, Germany, France, China, India, is going to be a lot quicker than its ability to convince the IMF. And in this case, the IMF being heavily led by the US, that I think it's just a little easier dealing with a few parties around the table rather than multilateral. I mean, ultimately, of course, if the multilateral organization can get the right objectives into the stability program, then it doesn't make any difference whether you lend through the multilateral organization or through the bilateral organization. The difference, of course, is the strategic advantage that you get. Right.
So it's basically a $10 billion $10 billion investment to get strategic gains, right?
Absolutely.
But there will be risks on these investments. What might be the risks?
Yeah. So there are risks. The risk is not, if you just measure it in pure currency terms, the risk is not high because it's either some newfangled European instrument or a European bond that you currently already own in the forex reserves. So in that sense, the pure security risk is not that different. But there could be the risk is, of course, that the plan is half baked, and so far the plans have all been half baked.
Yeah.
So in fact, in my article, what I write is that this time the actual victory we will have is to offer but not be taken on the offer. Yeah. I don't know whether we can play it that nuance, but if we can, that will be fantastic. That we actually seem to be a bilateral player in this, but we are not actually taken up today. We, 2-3 years from now, it is, it's a bit like, a student goes to the rich uncle and asks for funding. The rich uncle readily gives it, rich uncle in this case being China. Or the student goes to the young uncle who's just got a job, who has got good prospects, but has just got a job and can't quite afford it. But if that young uncle makes a little contribution to that student's life, he's one, made an impact, and two, he's got, that little student's credibility for life, not only that of the rich uncle. So it's a little bit of that game. Of course, you could say it's silly for the young uncle who's just got the job, who might put himself into difficulty because his balance sheet is not, and it's literally that same analogy. The only difference is that the young uncle has this forex reserve. That is a reallocation rather than. But India has to insist that the plan is not half-baked. And I think the very fact that you get into bilateral discussions and even talk about a rescue plan and improving the detail of that rescue plan gets you into I think the most direct benefit of this, if this happens, is that our Security Council, UN Security Council discussions become a lot easier. China is, of course, playing the game that if they actually consummate this thing, they will get significantly more leverage with Europe, number one, and number two, with Europe in the context of IMF. I think you will genuinely see that China will become equal in influence to the US in the IMF.
Right. So that's a 9-minute geoeconomics discussion. We talked about uncles and Europe and helping them in their financial stability. So we'll probably do more of this in the future. Right?
Thank you, Nitin. Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Narayan.